And this is a short story written by Nora. Well, it's part of the story, called The Widow and the Sweep. Larry Farrell sat on the big tailor's table in his brother Jim's kitchen, sewing buttons and putting braiding on the rig-outs of half the country. He was one of those people who, having been set down by circumstances in a particular walk of life, remain fixed there for good. People winked at one another and whispered that Jim was cute enough not to let Larry get any higher than the button sewing, afraid he'd set up in opposition. But it did not seem as if Larry himself ever thought of such a thing. Yet Jim had his own reasons for keeping Larry in complete ignorance of the noble art of cutting out. He knew that there was always danger, more especially when the pension age would have arrived, of that extraordinary upheaval of human nature known as love intervening to shatter the ligaments binding Larry to his table. So Larry pegged away, his mouth puckering in sympathy with every picker he made in the cloth, and his frosty beard going up and down with every draw of the needle. "Here, Larry," said Jim Farrell, giving a finishing touch with his goose on the waistcoat. "Here, Larry, take a run over to the Newlands with this suit of Master Harry's, and if there's any alterations to be done, be sure and take a note of it. Hurry into your Sunday duds now and make haste, for I see Croghan Hill looking blue, and that's a bad sign." "Smash it," said Larry, swinging himself off the table. "I wouldn't wish for anything that I had to leave them buttons before I had them finished, and I think I'll never be back soon enough to see how they'll look when they're all in." Little did Larry know that the relationship between him and his brother's table had been dissolved in the course of nature. Soon Larry found himself on the way to Newlands, footing it along with short, jerky steps and looking more Jack Frosty than usual amid the budding life of early spring. His head was full of buttons, bachelor and otherwise, so full indeed that it takes a splatter and a splash of raindrops and a trickle down the back of his neck to arouse his attention. And then he looks, first in apprehension at the blue-black rain cloud over the treetops, next in despair at the carefully pressed crease down the front of his brand-new trousers, and lastly, in desperation, at the house of the widow Mulready, over beside the big wall of Newlands. He humped himself up under a hedge, but it was not fully fledged yet, and the new leaves, disturbed, shed limpid drops over him, so that the brand-new trousers were getting uncomfortably sprinkled, not to mention Master Harry's suit in its brown paper bag. "Anything for the sake of appearance," cried Larry, making a rush for the widow's door, scrambling over her flower pots and puffing and blowing into her kitchen, where he stood, dabbing the raindrops off his trousers and screwing himself round to see if the back of it had got any. "Blow that rain! Am I much wet, Mrs. Mulready?" "Oh, not a bit at all, Mr. Farrell. You'll be as dry as a lime kiln in no time," exclaimed the widow, taking a turn around him and giving an odd flick of her apron here and there. "Wait now, stand easy a Vic. There's a little stream here on the back of your collar." And the widow carefully rubbed the back of Jim's neck with the corner of her apron. "Sit down here now in the corner and take a heat of the fire. Sure, what great hurry are ye in till the cloud passes over?" says she, "and I'll wet a drop of tea for me and you, comfortable like together." With that, the widow took down a nice blue teapot from the white dresser, and while she prepared the tea, Larry took out his specs and put them on, and then he remarked that there was a bunch of bachelor's button flowers on the table, and he remarked too that the widow's cheeks were as the flowers, and that she had two of the funniest brown eyes in the world, and not a streak of grey in her black hair. "Be the damn butt!" exclaimed Harry, as he sat with his hands on his knees, staring hard at her, while she wet the tea and turned the quarters of potato cake on the griddle. Slowly his eyes wandered in a wondering kind of way, up and down the tidy kitchen, from rafters to floor, till they reached the big window with the well-scoured table under it. And there they rested, up and down the table and the window, in a comparing stare. All at once he gave the table a terrible blow with his open hand, which had such an effect on the widow Mulready that it almost ended the triumphal career of the blue teapot. "Smash the lie on it!" he exclaimed again, as if a sudden convincing thought had struck him. "Aye, and dash the lie on it," said he, with still greater emphasis, staring hard at the widow as she handed him a mug of fragrant tea and a steaming plate of cake. "Aye, and blow and take all the buttons in Ireland," he said, turning his eyes to the bunch of bachelor's buttons. "Blow and take all the buttons that were ever buttoned, but the buttons there on your table and the buttons in your cake, Mrs. Mulready, I made the blushes, ma'am." Larry commenced at this to drink the tea in hurried mouthfuls, while the widow sipped hers bashfully. "Mrs. Mulready," said he, after looking over the specs at her for another start. "Mrs. Mulready, a tradesman's a tradesman when all is said and done. And if it was in the course of nature for a widow woman to marry a tradesman that could sew in buttons, a tradesman that could sew, that could make trousers with bachelor's buttons, dash it, bachelor's buttons, something, man. And I can't say it because I've never done anything but sew buttons. But I learn, so I will." The widow put up her apron to her face to hide her blushes. "Indeed, Mr. Farrell, Larry, I'm not much good at giving lessons, so I'm not. But sure, all I know—" "What would you know, ma'am? What the cut of a trousers, though if you'd like to give a helping hand at the stitching, I'll not be the one to stop you." "Oh, I thought it was the other sorts of lessons, Mr. Larry. I thought you didn't know how to say it and have an experience. I was going to—" But the widow did not get any farther, for at that instant the door was suddenly flung open and a couple of barefooted gossans, followed by a little girl, rushed in. "Oh, mother!" cried one of them. "We had a great time in school. The master was walking up and down the road from the window all day, and every bite that had passed he'd say, 'Is that a telegram?' Some of the big lads were saying that it's what he was looking to see if he was getting the sweep." "Isn't it well?" exclaimed the widow in a new tone of voice. "Isn't it well for some people that's paid for doing nothing? If he wanted a sweep, he could get plenty of both sweeps and tinkers round the half moon down there. A decent person can't see the door with them from one end of the day to the other. Sweeps indeed. Party connections." "Be the dang!" exclaimed Larry, the eye almost leaping out of his head with alarm, as three youngsters suddenly laid hands on and wouldn't let him hear his ears. "Be quiet, children, and listen for a minute," cried the blushing widow, as she noted Larry's sudden perturbation. "Not a word. You are going to have Mr. Farrell, Larry. Will I tell them what they are going to have? You are just saying." "Be the dang, but I never said anything, missus. And Larry, the dickens, and a ha'porth ever I said. Did I say anything?" said Larry, and he bounced up nervously.